What single human has done the most damage to the progression of humanity in the history of mankind? Guy Chorlyak. He was a surgeon in the 1300s who vehemently spoke out against another fellow surgeon, Theodoric Borgognoni. Theodoric was a surgeon who wrote about his theories on proper wound care and believed that the best thing you can do to a wound is wrap it and keep it clean. Guy hated what Theodoric was writing because it directly went against the teachings of Galen, an ancient Greek surgeon who believed pus was the body's way of balancing your humors. Guy's teachings were widely accepted, and it's believed that his ignorance set the development of antisepsis in surgery back about 600 years. Guy Chorlyak was born in the 1300s, not 1200s, as he was alive during the Black Death. Ignaz Semmelweis was the guy who was thrown into a mental asylum for saying surgeons should wash their hands between seeing patients. If I remember correctly, there was also a French physician who discovered some valuable kinds of anesthetics, but was ignored by the medical community because he couldn't write in Latin. His name was Ambroise Parr. From Wikipedia, Parr discovered that the soldiers treated with the boiling oil were in agony, whereas the ones treated with the ointment had recovered because of the antiseptic properties of turpentine. This proved this method's efficacy, and he avoided cauterization thereafter. However, treatments such as this were not widely used until many years later. He published his first book, The Method of Curing Wounds Caused by Arquebus and Firearms, in 1545. Injured soldiers continued to be treated with boiling oil for many years because Parr's discovery was snubbed. Emperor Gaozong of China. This is kind of an obscure story, so let me tell you the whole thing. It was the 12th century. When people talk about how China used to be the most technologically advanced part of the world, this is the period they are talking about. Some historians add they were on the brink of industrializing. Then Manchuria invaded and conquered northern China. The imperial court retreated to the south and declared Gaozong, the emperor's brother, as the new emperor. China's top general Yu Fei, who, according to some records, literally had patriotism tattooed on his back, though that might have been made up by someone who wanted to emphasize how unfair the rest of this story is, rallied the army and defeated the Manchus, and was raring to chase them out. But he gets orders from Gaozong to back down because he'd rather negotiate. These negotiations end up signing away the north half of China. A few years later, the Manchus invade again. Yu Fei beats them again and pushes all the way back to the old capital Kaifeng. Then he gets the order to retreat. He responds with a letter saying that he's got the Manchus on the ropes and he can reconquer northern China in like a month. No, says the emperor, retreat immediately. Eventually, Yu Fei does retreat, but he delays long enough to evacuate the city first, making up some logistical issues as an excuse. At this point, you may be wondering why Gaozong was so reluctant to push an advantage. The answer is that his brother was still alive. The king of Manchuria liked to bring him out once in a while and make fun of him. If Yu Fei reconquered China, he might liberate the rightful emperor, and Gaozong would be out of a job. As such, Gaozong was actively trying to throw the war, and he interpreted Yu Fei's delay at the end of this war as meaning that he had reached the point of at least considering going rogue. So as soon as Yu Fei got back, he was arrested and promptly executed on treason on the ground of avowal. He might have done something, presumably because the optics on the actual charge, almost winning a war we wanted to lose, were too bad. People realize that this is bull quickly enough, and there are protests. But Gaozong manages to pin everything on one of his advisors and placated the mob by executing him. So how does this affect the long-term progression of humanity? Well, as I said, China might have been on the brink of industrializing at the time, but didn't have access to enough coal. There are coal deposits in China, but they're all in the north. Second, the Manchus never really got their internal issues sorted out, and 70 years later, were easily conquered by the Mongols, who then recruited a bunch of disaffected Chinese siege engineers. This essentially removed the one weakness of horse archer hordes: they are not good at taking fortresses, and allowed them to wreck half the world. Had China been united at the time, and had been ruled fairly recently by a guy who had, if you recall, been taken prisoner by invaders from the north, so you can bet the defenses would be fairly well maintained, they probably could not have done this. So had it not been for the malice of this one man, the Mongols would probably never have become the juggernaut they eventually did, and the Industrial Revolution might have happened about 500 years ahead of schedule. Yongle, Emperor of the Ming Dynasty in China, ordered the fleet of Zhenghe, the greatest trading and exploration fleet of the time, to be burned during his reign in the early 1400s. This was the beginning of an era of isolation for Chinese kingdoms, which ultimately led to the collapse of Imperial China, and indirectly to the rise of the PRC. Additionally, the wealth of the world overall decreased as a result of reduced trade with China, and if China had continued exploring, it is possible that they, not Europeans, would have colonized North America instead of merely maybe discovering it then telling no one as they did in history. It may not be a significant alteration of human progress, but it's one of those events that sets the world in a definitively different direction. Edit didn't say the Chinese did discover America, just that they might have, because it's been theorized that they did, and they had the technology. I mean, the Inuit and Siberians have been crossing the Bering Sea in leather kayaks for thousands of years, so the Chinese definitely could have done it too if they wandered up that far. I don't know much about the actual history of that theory, and most of my comments on that are from Wikipedia searches this morning and willingness to believe fun hidden history scenarios that are actually possible. As a caveat, it would have hugely changed naval history too. It would be accurate to say that Europeans and their methods of sailing enabled European-led globalization and colonization. The durability of their designs, relative speed and range were critical developments with a measurable impact on the world. But really, the Chinese had a totally different system which would have really worked just as well, if not better. European ships were relatively small and had canvas sails, while the great Chinese ships that Zhenghe used were massive, and used these kind of folding bamboo sails, ingenious for their strength and manageability. They even had watertight compartments, something European ships didn't even consider using for centuries. Both parts of the world produced ships that could do what the other kind did, while looking extremely different. So as a maritime history buff, I'm totally fascinated by how things on the high seas would have looked had the Yongle Emperor not stifled Chinese naval expansion in the cradle. Edit book recommendations are anything by Brian Lavery and Robert Gardiner. I would suggest Andrew Wakefield. His work ileal lymphoid nodular hyperplasia, non-specific colitis, and pervasive developmental disorder in children has been directly responsible for the mistrust of vaccines, the decline of Western rates of vaccination, and basically telling everybody that there's a boogeyman underneath your bed. He is directly responsible for thousands and thousands of deaths. He's a scientist who made a mistake. Why are you blaming him? It's not that he made a mistake. He had purposely customized the outcomes to meet the hypothesis, so that he could get rich selling safe vaccines and diagnostic kits. He poisoned the well that saved so many people, just so he could get rich. I have no idea how he can sleep at night. Thomas Midgley Jr. in 1921. This guy that discovered that tetraethyl lead could be used as an anti-knocking fuel additive for cars. It satisfied the needs of oil companies at the time, because it worked, was cheap, and was patentable for that purpose. But it was also incredibly toxic, and burning leaded gasoline was hugely pollutive eventually. After the creation of the EPA and an oil crisis in the mid-70s, leaded gas was banned in 1996, but the damage was done. Interestingly, the guy didn't even show up for the occasion when the first customer filled up their car with leaded gas, because he was at home, sick with lead poisoning. Sir Mark Sykes. This man was the British element in the Sykes-Picot Agreement. For those of you not in the know, 100 years ago the Middle East was an area that did have some nations and some more tribal areas. So people were more divided by language and culture, some by religion. France and Britain decided to carve up the Middle East into easier to govern territories, but fumbled this task and instead divided the territories on the map over these religious and tribal lines. Not only has this been a main contributing cause of conflict in the Middle East, if you take two opposing or rival groups and then suddenly group them as one country, what do you expect? But said conflicts have then fueled further conflicts again and again. This has then been further used by Islamic extremists as a reason to hate the Western powers, as they were the ones who created this terrible agreement. Even Sykes himself accepted that the agreement's wording should be changed in order to give those countries autonomous rule. What is a little sad is he actually seemed to want to help these regions with the agreement, but just bumbled the whole thing, which has led to most of the issues the Middle East has to this day. Sykes didn't make the modern Middle East though. He just played a large part in creating the circumstances in which its current problems thrive. Imagine all of the advancement, education and collaboration that could have happened had the Middle East been allowed to flourish unhindered and without resentment. That monk who glued a page of geometry and algebra together to write prayers on it instead set the world of maths back about 400 years. Edit, here you go. A Greek monastery held the papers for a whole. Then it was overwritten with prayers link. Edit, while not whole. I think I've read several theories about this, however, that make this far less impactful than the popular narrative suggests it is. 1. This was unlikely to be the only copy of Archimedes' work, especially as even in Constantinople it was very far from its place of origin. 2. Monasteries in general were wont to protect any kind of text, and not merely those that were religious in nature. The fact then that they chose to overwrite this suggests that they did not believe this to be a particularly uncommon text at the time, lending further credence to point 1. 3. There were many other texts in the palimpsest other than Archimedes' Codex C, which one could make an equal argument as to the importance of. The choice of exalting one at the expense of all the others is technically just as much an overwriting, especially given the fact that it was not uncommon to write over expensive parchment at the time, for the work was overwritten only 700 years after it was first written. This makes it very unlikely to have been instrumental in any mathematical advancement had it not been overwritten regardless. 5. The fact that this manuscript survived, while few if any other copies of Archimedes' work survived, is less a testament to Monk's persistent overwriting, but more to do with how well taken care of the palimpsest was. Compare its fate in the 700 years it was in the possession of the church to what happened in the next 100 years alone. One could also ask what happened to every other copy of Archimedes' Codex C. That's at least my layman understanding of the matter. I might not be correct on all the details, but it's at least not as cut and dry as one errant monk erasing a few hundred years of mathematics. Genghis Khan. While he personally didn't do much to hinder human progress, his reign began an era of Mongol expansionism and devastation, and his successors were responsible for the destruction of the House of Wisdom of Baghdad, ending the Islamic Golden Age, and not to mention the destruction of numerous cities and the deaths of many. Also, the Mongol Empire eventually paved the way for the Black Death. The empire led to many trade routes being formed between Europe and Asia, which eventually led to the transmission of the Black Death to Europe in the 14th century. Thomas Midgley, Jr. single-handedly reduced the IQ of the entire nation of the US due to airborne lead poisoning from his invention of leaded gasoline. Then, upon hearing it was dangerous, launched a campaign to point out how it wasn't dangerous. He is responsible for 7 million tons of lead being put into the atmosphere between the years of 1922 to 2000- when leaded gasoline was finally banned worldwide. Not satisfied with his destruction of air quality, however, he then went on to invent freon, which punched a hole in the ozone layer some 40 years later. Truly, this man's war on human lungs and quality of life is unmatched. Whoever seized all of Nikola Tesla's chests and papers after he died? While Tesla was a good engineer and made some significant contributions in his field, he was not some genius who was ahead of his time that some internet cultists like to believe. He lacked the background of rigorous scientific methods and refused to accept modern physics. One of the reasons why many of his inventions didn't work out is because they couldn't. Because of his misconceptions about how laws of physics work. I'm more inclined toward Faraday for his dedication to his science and humility, and Maxwell for his genius in translating Faraday's experiments into a true rigorous theoretical framework. The work of Faraday and Maxwell directly led to deeper questioning on how light and energy work, which led to Einstein's own theoretical framework on special relativity and Planck's theory of quanta of energy. They created the foundation of the idea that fields of energy form the basis of reality. The elegance in Maxwell's equations and Faraday's experiments are beauty and inspiration manifested. Thanks for watching. Consider subscribing for more videos.